Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Steve, and we are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, and Richard Lim's This American President, and more. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more about these great shows. I'd like to quickly mention we are back on Patreon. There are 4 tiers. There's so many different benefits to joining the History of the Papacy on Patreon. There's bonus audio, video content, but most importantly, you will be included on the History of the Papacy diptychs, which is, in traditional Christianity, is the list of bishops in order of their commemoration. So you want to join up on Patreon sooner so that your name is higher on the list. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs, which you can join at patreon.com/History of the Papacy. We have Roberto, Yoren, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level, Dapo, Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at the Constantinople level, and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome, we have Peter the Great. Now today, Dr. Carolyn McNamara of the University of Glasgow joins us yet again to lead us through another great topic in the conversion of the Irish to Christianity. Today we'll talk about monasteries, abbots, and bishops, and the roles that each of these institutions played in Irish Christianity. We'll talk about new evidence and new interpretations on how the Irish Church was organized in this early period. With that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian Church. Now, there's been a fairly recent change in scholarship on what the role of the bishop was in Ireland. What was the traditional scholarship on the role of the bishop, and how was that sort of modified since maybe the 80s?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the previous understanding was that, there's this, huge blossoming of monastic life in Ireland, I think to a degree that you don't frequently see elsewhere. Just the sheer number of monasteries in Ireland is impressive. So there was this belief that it was the abbots themselves that were the most important ecclesiastical figures in Ireland and North Britain in this early medieval period, and that they, held a higher status even than bishops. And some of this belief was based on, I think, just the point that we were in understanding the materials that we had at the time. So as I've said, we've constantly been evolving in how we understand materials and how we work with them, and maybe even what's been translated. We may have this huge pile of materials, but if we haven't had time to properly have a look at it and compare them with each other and really make sure we're understanding what's going on, then we're not going to have as good an understanding as we do, once that work has been done. And I think that's part of what went into this previous perspective versus how we view it now. So there's not as many discussions of bishops because you are unlikely to have as many bishops as abbots. Every monastery needs an abbot, but not every monastery needs a bishop. And even at my favorite monastery at Bangor, they only had a few bishops ever. So we can kind of take that into mind as we're thinking about, what this understanding was. But yeah, starting around the 1980s, they really started to readdress some of these earlier perspectives and realize that, when we talk about these monks and these monasteries, the monks themselves were not likely to be in clerical orders themselves. It wasn't a requirement of being a monk. And even if you're not in monastic orders and you haven't taken, an oath of being a monk, there's an even larger pool of lay brothers that existed around a monastery who were associated perhaps just because they lived on land owned by the monastery. So there's this large lay population that's associated with the monastery. And, none of those people needed to be in clerical orders. And we've come to understand more and more that, all of this pastoral care that's required in the church was under the purview of the bishop. The abbot didn't have the right to ordain clerics. He may not have been ordained himself. So the bishop needed to do that. And the bishop was the one who had the right to, bring a church into use as a sacred place. And so they're the ones who had that power. And they were the ones who were charged with the good working of a church and making sure that, the people received the sacraments that they needed, whether it's, birth or baptism or, final rites and burial. So that was all under the purview of the bishop. So this thought that had existed about, the abbots being the ones in charge because there were maybe so many of them. And I think there was also some confusion in that there wasn't a big city for a bishop to kind of have as his seat of his power. There was no York, there was no Canterbury for these bishops to be located at, I think was part of what led to that previous understanding, but that we're getting better and better at seeing how it more likely was today with this, monasteries and abbots being more concerned about their monastic lives than about the pastoral care of the wider communities. And we see that even in the life of St. Columba. And if people are interested in early medieval religious lives, I highly recommend reading the life of St. Columba. It's really easy to read. There's a really good translation by Richard Sharp. It's got the earliest mention of the Loch Ness monster in it. So it's lots of fun. But we also see in it that Columba himself, as described by Adamnan 100 years later, his focus wasn't on conversion. This is very different from what we see with Patrick. He's interested in his own community. And the times that you'll see him involved with conversions are when people have specifically come to him and said, Columba, please, do this for me. I'm about to die. I want to die a Christian, or what have you. That they've specifically come to him to ask him personally for intervention.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because Ireland wasn't in the Roman Empire, that organization would be a little bit different, but maybe not quite as different as what earlier scholars thought.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting and trying to wrap my own head around it, because, even before I started to do my PhD, was kind of brought up in that previous understanding. It started changing, from the 1980s, but it wasn't really well codified even as recently as when I started my own research, officially. I hadn't had access to that to understand that my understanding was wrong. So I had to grow and learn. And we've got differences in kind of what society looks like, because there wasn't this Roman superstructure that was, put in place in these places. And so their previous societal structure that was based generally around the Tua and those small kingdoms and kingships tended to be, your normal base level of societal organization.
And now a word from our sponsors. And it's also, do you think that there might have been sort of a viewing it through a different lens, such as that in the later part of the Middle Ages, there was monastic orders that didn't necessarily answer to the local bishop. They might answer to another abbot in a larger part of their structure, or they even answered directly to the Pope. And so maybe they were looking at it that maybe that's how things were organized in Ireland.
I think there was some thought that was how things were organized, especially this idea that rather than looking to a local bishop, that dependent foundations looked instead to the abbot of the monastery from which they were founded. And what I've come to understand is that there can be some ties similar to that, but they're more so ties about secular structure, I guess is the best way to put it. So it might affect the pool of candidates from which an abbot is pulled, whether that's from the monastery that founded their foundation, whether it was from the family of the local secular ruler that caused them to be founded, whether it was a community that caused them to be founded. That may put some obligations on them structurally. But as far as the actual religious or sacramental part of their existence goes, that would have still gone back to the local bishop as the person in charge.
So going into the church organization of Ireland, maybe let's talk a little bit about how bishops, monasteries, and then dependent churches all fit together.
Yeah, so as I've just said, kind of with those dependent churches, they might look to the direction from which they were founded. And if that's coming directly from the bishop going, hey, we need a church in this area, then that's pretty straightforward. And as I've mentioned, it might be a local secular ruler who's decided that he wants to found a church or a monastery. But this is an opportunity for him to prove his wealth, maybe his power, his prestige. So he says, yep, I want to found a monastery or a church. He still needs to get that monastery's church or that church consecrated by the bishop. So he can't just sidestep the bishop. Nobody can really sidestep the bishop because the bishop decides every church, that's going to get consecrated. He's got to approve it, because if he refuses to do it, then it's, maybe it can be a chapel, but it can't be a consecrated church. So we've got that for the dependent churches. The monasteries, as I've mentioned, most monks were not themselves ordained, so they didn't really function in terms of the pastoral care of the community. They could, create themselves or create dependent facilities based off of them, but that's still going to be dependent for their own pastoral care, because they need pastoral care as well, which is going to be under the purview of the bishop. And maybe they've got a bishop that lives on site at their monastery and can take care of those activities for them. Or maybe they're looking to someone at Armagh or someone at Rosemarkie, if we want to look at the north of Britain and modern day Scotland. There's some differences there as far as if you've got a local bishop or maybe one a bit further away. And then let me see, as far as the bishops, as I've mentioned, they kind of held the most power as they were required for ordination of clergy and consecration of churches and the good management of their churches. There's also some records saying that they would act as an anamachara or a soul friend to both rulers and abbots. And that's kind of a position like a confessor. So that's the person that you'd confess to. And so that kind of, I think, explains their relationship really well by saying that they're the ones who are the confessor. And we know some additional information about the power of the bishops. The first synod of Patrick, as it was called, was known as a synodus episcoporum, or an episcopal synod, which indicates that, it's the power of the bishops that caused that synod to exist.
At this point, were there any bishoprics that were kind of rising above the other ones to maybe make a situation like in the Roman Empire of a metropolitan or a bishop that had some authority over other bishoprics?
Yeah, I think the first people on the scene to try and start doing that were really at Armagh. And so that's where we have the earliest manuscript, including Patrick's Confessio and his letter to Coroticus, comes from Armagh, because they were trying to kind of gather all of this Patrick material together and start making, a dossier, if you like, to prove that, well, we're associated with Patrick. And so that gives us primacy in Ireland. And so we should be able to decide everything. And that's kind of where you get this idea. I know I mentioned between Patrick and Brigid, who's controlling, say, the north half is Patrick and the south half is Brigid. It's really Armagh, I think, is kind of first on the scene to do this. I think that's in maybe the 8th to 9th centuries that really starts to get going.
You can kind of see with abbots versus bishops, where abbots have almost like a bishop-light authority, that they have a lot of power over their community, and their communities can be pretty large, especially if you consider the monks, plus if there's a town nearby where they're going to be kind of a default bishop-like person. So you can see where they might get a little big for their britches and want to push back a little bit against a bishop who might be trying to take control over or impose some sort of authority over a big monastery.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. If we've got a large monastery that's got, a lot of, manig, I think is the old Irish word that comes to mind, but it's the kind of people who live on the land that's owned by the monastery, and maybe they're required to contribute, materials or food to its upkeep. If you've got a monastery that has a lot of land and it's got a lot of workshops, and maybe it's got a scriptorium, so it's got a lot of book production, and it's heavily involved in the intelligentsia kind of making new manuscripts. So yeah, that abbot of that monastery is going to have a lot of kind of boots on the ground power, if you like. And so, yeah, I can see, especially when we're looking at such powerful abbots, I would expect humans always being human, that there would have been some people who probably got a bit big for their britches and maybe had to, get put back in their place by their bishops. But yeah, us, looking backwards as historians or people investigating the past, seeing the degree of cohesion and organization and control that these people would have, I can see that confusion happening. And it's mentioned very literally in a number of rules of different saints or their monasteries, or in the life of St. Covgall. It's mentioned that immediate obedience is required, and that in Covgall's monastery, if you were rebuked by another monk, it didn't matter who it was. Maybe he was made a monk yesterday and he rebuked you, and you've been a monk in this monastery for 30 years. Maybe he thinks you took the last of the table salt, who knows? And he rebukes you for it. You're expected to immediately fall upon your knees, no questions asked, and accept the rebuke. So that's kind of the level of, obedience that they're at least wanting to project exists. Whether or not that's actually the case is a whole nother conversation we could have, but that's what they want to project in these manuscripts that they're leaving for us. So we can get a bit of an understanding of what this authority for an abbot might look like in these big, prestigious monasteries.
And now a word from our sponsors. We've talked about abbots and bishops and priests. What were some of the other high status positions within the Irish Church?
Yeah, that's a great point. So there's Principatus, which is sometimes mentioned, and that's, of course, a Latin term. And this is a basic kind of leadership type title. So that would be a leadership position that may be someone who works for the abbot or with the abbot. We don't always see a Principatus and an abbot together, so there's still some questions about exactly where these positions fall vis-a-vis each other. Another one that's right in that kind of area is Equonimus, which is a steward. So if you've got, as we say, this big monastery with all these working and moving parts, maybe he'd have a principatus or an economus who's, working alongside with him to organize all this. Because even if we're relying on the bishop for the pastoral care, just the running day to day of a monastery that's as large as we've been supposing would require a lot of structure. There's ductor, which is a Latin word, again, for a teacher. And so we see these people mentioned in the annals about, these very learned people or these ductors, teachers in the church dying. We've got scriba versus scriptor. And again, both Latin words. So when we think of scriba today, we're kind of going to automatically go scribe in our minds because the words look cognate. And when we think of a scribe, we're thinking of like a note taker or someone who's just copying down other people's works. So a copyist. But in the annals, we're seeing these scriba or scribi being mentioned for their deaths, and we can't imagine that the few scribi whose deaths we see recorded are the only copyists that existed in early medieval Ireland. Otherwise, we wouldn't have nearly so many surviving manuscripts. So the scriba position has come to be understood as what we would think today as an author. So the scriptor would be the version of the copyist that we'd think of. So I like to think of it as the scribi creating the new content and the scriptores copying them down so more versions of them existed. And then the final word or term that I wanted to mention today was the comarb or comarba, which is the heir or the heirs. It's usually just a single one. So it's generally of a saint. So you'll see the comarba of Covgall, so that'll be the heir of St. Covgall. And this is frequently also an abbot and frequently also the abbot of the main foundation of that saint. So you'll see the comarba of Covgall usually residing at Bangor, although sometimes you'll see, and towards the end of the 10th century for Bangor, you'll see the comarba located elsewhere. I think the abbot just before St. Malachy ended up dying at Lismore in the south of Ireland. So that's a big question. Like, what's he doing down there? Is Lismore closely related to Bangor? Like, what's going on? And then Malachy, who was at that Lismore, becomes the new abbot of Bangor. So yeah, that's when we start getting into all these networks between churches, and that's kind of where I get really interested. What's going on? Why are these people, hanging out with each other?
Is that kind of a unique position in Irish Christianity, this idea of a Covmar, or does it have an analogy in maybe the Roman or the European church?
That's a good question, and I have to say I'm not too sure. You might be able to help me think about that. If there's this concept of, someone who has received maybe the authority of the founding saint and is viewed, acting with the same kind of authority as that saint, then that would be the kind of position that this comarb is taking. Now, there are situations in Ireland where the comarb ends up being someone very secular, someone not in even monastic orders. And, that's, of course, an issue if you're into the religious life, and that's where things get a bit murky. But the idea of it is meant to be, that you're taking on this position or this authority of, Covgall or Patrick or Columba.
It's interesting. So was this before the person's death? Would they say that this is going to be my Covmar, or was that somebody who would say, I'm going to be this person's?
My understanding is that it's not really somebody that's, designated ahead of time. It's not like you're choosing your next in line to the throne, if we think of it in terms of a regnal situation. But it frequently is the next person who takes over that abbacy you could think of as the comarb. But when we get to a point where we've got a comarb of, well, you'll have one person who's a comarb of both Patrick and Columba. And you're like, right, he can't simultaneously be abbot of both of these monasteries. So how is that working? What is that doing? And those are questions that I think still need some more discussion. And I think they're really interesting. The idea that one person can simultaneously, be viewed as this heir of two different saints in two different areas. And we might look at, okay, well, where's he located? And what does that relationship have to do with the interests of these other two cults of these saints? So yeah, there's a lot to look into there.
Yeah, because it is it kind of reminds me of maybe scholarship where you could kind of be like the intellectual descendant of the person who trained you, but there could be a lot of people like that too. Almost you could kind of use the word disciple, like you've learned from this person and you might be carrying on their tradition, kind of.
I can see where you're going with that, but there's only one comarb at a time. So it's almost like if you get the chair of Celtic studies at, the University of Oxford, we'll say, just as an example, the only one person can be that chair at a time, but the level of distinguishedness, which may or may not be a word, but I'm going with it. The level of distinguishedness of that position is affected by, say, the first person who held that chair, as, the very first person. And so you'll kind of keep that being distinguished, for the new people who hold that position. And you've got this tie back in time to the first person that held that position. I think it's a bit more like that. But again, we start to get these positions that are not staying at their initial monastery. So then we have to go, what's up with that?
And it's pretty obvious who would actually be this person. It can't be just Joe, who was a minor league monk with Patrick for a few years, isn't going to be the comarb. It's, nobody's going to recognize him as such. And it's pretty obvious who's going to be that person.
Yeah, that's a great question. Like exactly what that process is, I think is maybe hard for us to get at. Because as far as I'm aware, there's no manuscript that's like, right, this is how we choose the next guy. But we can see sometimes these are going to be based on familial lines. So if we look at the monastery at Iona, the first 9 or 10 abbots that follow Columba are from his same kin group. Adovnan, the 9th abbot of Iona, was related to Columba. So we sometimes see them coming that way through the family of the founding saint. Sometimes we'll see them just as, there's some other relation that's where they get the abbacy. And for me, it starts to get a bit more, gray as far as how that process might work when, again, we're going to people at other monasteries.